5 days after my parents' funeral, my sister changed the locks on the farmhouse I had kept alive for 14 years. She stood there in our mother's robe, holding our mother's cracked apple mug, and told me I was not family anymore. I was just the hired help who got too comfortable. My name is Marin Whitlock. I was 37, an accountant, and the only person who knew every payroll record, co-op contract, cold storage bill, and tax file on Whitlock Orchard Farm. Tessa thought changing one lock made her the owner. She did not know that the work she mocked was exactly what my parents had written into a $27 million trust. And when the lawyer opened the second envelope, my sister's face went pale. Chapter 1, The Key Would Not Turn. I stood on the front porch of the Whitlock farmhouse with my overnight bag on one shoulder, my black funeral dress still folded over my arm, and the same brass key I had carried since I was 16 pressed between my fingers. 5 days earlier I had stood beside two fresh graves at First Creek Baptist Church and watched the last handfuls of Virginia dirt cover my parents. Now I was standing outside the home I had lived in almost my entire life, the home where I had cared for them, kept their books, and helped run Whitlock Orchard Farm for 14 years, and my key no longer fit the lock. At first, I thought my hands were shaking too hard. Grief does that. It makes ordinary things feel unfamiliar. So I took a breath, wiped my thumb across the key, and tried again. Nothing the lock was new. Before I could knock, the door opened from the inside. My sister, Tessa Whitlock Vale, stood there in my mother's faded blue robe. That was the first thing I noticed. Not her face, not the hard line of her mouth, the robe. Mom had worn it every morning, usually with one hand wrapped around a coffee mug and the other flipping through invoices at the kitchen table. Tessa was holding that mug too, the white one with the little apple painted on the side, the one Mom had used until the handle cracked, and Dad glued it back together because she refused to throw it away. Tessa had been back on the farm less than a week, and she had already stepped into our mother's clothes like grief was a costume she had earned. Behind her stood Grant Vale, her ex-husband, though ex never seemed to mean much when there was money nearby. Grant was 48, slick-haired, square-jawed, and always dressed like he was about to sell something. He did not look like a man who had come to mourn. His eyes moved past me, over the porch rails, across the driveway, toward the barn, the orchards, the long gravel road, the equipment shed, the cattle pasture beyond the fence. He looked at our farm the way a man looks at acreage on a brochure. Tessa leaned one shoulder against the doorframe. "You need to start packing," she said. I was hoping to avoid making this embarrassing. I looked at the lock, then back at her. "You changed the locks." She lifted the mug to her mouth like she had been living there for years instead of days. "It is my house now. Probate has not even started, I said. And Ellis said the estate and trust administration meeting is set for next Thursday." Tessa gave a small laugh, the kind she used when we were kids and I had mispronounced a word at dinner. "You always did love paperwork, but paperwork does not change the fact that I am the eldest daughter. Someone has to lead this family now, and it is not going to be the farm bookkeeper." Grant smiled at that. I stood very still. Tessa tilted her head and looked me over, from my muddy shoes to the binder under my arm. "You were never the heir, Marin. You were the hired help who got too comfortable." The words hit harder than I expected. Maybe because she said them wearing Mom's robe. Maybe because Dad's work boots were still by the back door. Maybe because I had spent the last 5 days choosing caskets, calling relatives, writing an obituary, and making sure the men who worked our orchards still got paid on Friday. I did not scream. I did not push past her. I did not beg my sister to let me back into the house where I had sat beside our mother through every arthritis flare, every tax season, every sleepless night after Dad's blood pressure got bad. I just looked at the new lock and understood something cold and simple. Tessa had started taking things before any legal document had been opened. What she did not know then was that the one thing she had just used to humiliate me, the work, the records, the years of being called dependable instead of important, would become the exact reason she would lose the right to touch the farm. Whitlock Orchard Farm sat on 238 acres in Shenandoah County, Virginia. Apple orchards rolled behind the house in neat lines my grandfather had planted by hand. Beyond them were cattle pasture, a cold storage building, the equipment shed, A creek that cut through the back field, and a strip of road frontage developers had been circling for years. To people driving by, it looked peaceful. To me, it was payroll, insurance, feed invoices, tax deadlines, co-op contracts, equipment leases, frost warnings, harvest schedules, and cold storage temperatures that could ruin a season if they were off by 3 degrees. My father, Hugh Whitlock, had turned the farm from a family orchard into a real operation. My mother, Lenora, kept the books until arthritis made her fingers swell so badly she could not hold a pen by noon. She taught me everything at the kitchen table: how to match invoices, how to question a number that looked too clean, how to pay workers before paying yourself, how to keep records so clear that a stranger could open a binder and understand the truth. I graduated with an accounting degree in 2010 and came home in 2011. I told myself it would be temporary. I would help Mom through one tax season, maybe two. Then Dad needed help with payroll. Then the Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative needed one point of contact. Then Mom's hands got worse. Then the farm became less like a place I had returned to and more like a body I knew how to keep breathing. Tessa left in 2010 and never looked back. She said she was not going to waste her life smelling manure, bruised apples, and diesel. For 15 years, she missed harvests, repairs, birthdays, doctor appointments, and every quiet crisis that never made it into a holiday card. She called when a marriage failed, when a job ended, when she needed money wired fast. Mom always sent something. Dad always pretended not to be hurt. The accident happened at the end of October 2025 on Route 340. Mom and Dad were driving back from the farmer's market when a pickup crossed the center line in the rain. Dad died before the ambulance arrived. Mom made it to Valley Regional Medical Center, but she never woke up. I sat beside her bed and held her hand until the nurse came in and turned off the monitor. When I called Tessa after midnight, she did not ask if Mom had been in pain. She did not ask whether Dad had known what happened. Her first question was about life insurance. Her second was about the house. I swallowed both answers like stones. I handled the funeral because someone had to. I called the funeral home. I wrote the obituary. I spoke with Pastor Malcolm Reed at First Creek Baptist Church. I notified Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative. I checked payroll because Mateo Alvarez and Caleb Dunn still had families to feed, even if mine had just been split open. Tessa arrived late, with Grant in the passenger seat of her rental car. Before she hugged me, Grant asked how many acres the farm had. Before he said he was sorry, he asked how far the driveway sat from the highway. I said nothing, but I noticed. At the funeral, June Calloway, Mom's closest friend, took my hand in both of hers. June was 70, retired from the county library, and had known my mother since before Tessa and I were born. She looked at me with swollen eyes and said my mother had told her that everything that mattered had already been protected. I did not understand what she meant. I remembered it anyway. Now 5 days later, I stood in the hallway of my parents' house while Tessa watched me collect what she thought were scraps. My laptop, a USB drive, payroll records, co-op contract copies, insurance files, cold storage logs. The binders Mom had taught me to build one tab at a time. Grant chuckled when he saw me carrying them. Paper does not change blood, he said. I did not answer him. I carried everything across the yard to the barn office above the equipment shed. The room was cold, dusty, and smelled like old wood, oil, and hay, but it had a door I could lock and a desk that had belonged to my father. I set the binders down, opened my laptop, and started a timeline: the day Tessa arrived, the day the locks changed, the words she used, Grant's presence, the documents I removed, the fact that no court, no attorney, and no trust officer had given her authority to do any of it. That night, after the house went dark, I turned off the barn office lamp and looked out the small window toward the farmhouse. A light was still on in the kitchen. Through the cracked glass, I heard Tessa's voice carry across the yard. Call whoever you talked to in Charlottesville, she told Grant. I want this farm listed before the end of the week. I stood there in the cold, my hand still on the light switch. That was when I understood. Tessa did not just want the house. She wanted to sell all 238 acres of Whitlock Orchard Farm before anyone had the chance to open the papers that mattered. Chapter 2, by 5 the next morning, I was awake before the sun and already pulling on my boots. Grief had made the house feel impossible, but the farm did not wait for grief to become convenient. Cattle still needed water. The cold storage temperature still had to be checked. The equipment log still needed yesterday's notes. Act. The Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative still expected apples by the end of the week, and no one there cared that my sister had suddenly decided she was queen of everything our parents had built. Act. I crossed the yard with my jacket zipped to my chin and a flashlight in my hand. Frost silvered the pasture fence. The orchard rows were dark and quiet, bare branches, reaching into the gray morning like hands that had not yet learned they were empty. Act. At the cattle trough, I broke a thin skin of ice with the heel of my boot and checked the water line. Then I walked to the cold storage building and read the temperature twice, just like Dad had taught me. 35 degrees, stable. Act. The Honeycrisps still had time. The galas were already sorted. The last bins for the co-op needed to go out Friday. I wrote it all down in the equipment log because that was what you did when a farm was in trouble. You did not panic first. Act. You documented first. By 6:30, Mateo Alvarez was standing outside the barn office with his cap in both hands. Mateo had been our orchard foreman for 9 harvest seasons. He was 41, quiet, careful, act, and the only person besides me who could look at a bruised bin of apples and tell you which crew had picked it. His wife cleaned rooms at a motel in Woodstock. They had 2 kids, both still young enough to leave drawings in the cab of his truck. Act. He looked embarrassed, which made me angry before he even spoke. Marin, I'm sorry to bother you this early. You're not bothering me. He looked toward the farmhouse, then back at me. Your sister told me yesterday I was done. Act. Said the farm was being sold and there was no reason to keep paying seasonal people. For 1 second, all I could hear was the hum of the old heater behind me. She told you that directly? He nodded. Said I should clear out my tools by Friday. Act. Said Grant had people coming to look at the land. I opened my laptop and pulled up the timeline file. What time did she tell you? Around 4. By the south shed. Was anyone with you? Caleb was close enough to hear some of it. Act. I typed every word. Mateo watched my hands move over the keyboard. So is it true? I looked up at him. I don't know what my parents' documents say yet, but I do know Tessa has not been given authority to fire you, sell land, cancel contracts, act or shut down operations. His shoulders dropped a little, not with relief, but with the weight of not knowing whether relief was safe. Don't sign anything from her, I said. Don't turn in your keys, keep your phone on. If anything changes, act. I'll tell you before anyone else does. He nodded slowly. I just need to know if I should start looking somewhere else. You know how it is. I did know. That was the part Tessa did not understand. A farm was not just land and a house. Act. It was people timing rent around harvest checks. It was families planning groceries around payroll. It was men like Mateo pretending not to be scared because they did not want to make my grief heavier. I won't lie to you, I said. Act. But I won't let her erase you without a record either. Caleb Dunn showed up 20 minutes later with grease on his sleeve and his jaw tight. He was 28, our farm mechanic and cattle hand. Act. And he had kept Dad's oldest tractor running through 3 seasons it had no business surviving. She told me I'm finished too, he said. Said I might as well head over to Rockingham County if I want work. Did she put that in writing? Act. He gave a humorless laugh. Tessa doesn't seem like the writing things down type. No, I said, adding his name to the timeline. But I am. By 8, my phone rang. Deanna Pike's name flashed across the screen. Act. Deanna ran contracts at Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative, and she had the kind of voice that could turn a room quiet without raising itself. Marin, she said, I need you to tell me what's going on before I decide whether to call my attorney. Act. My stomach tightened. What did Tessa do? She called the co-op office 10 minutes ago. Said she was the new owner of Whitlock Orchard Farm and wanted to cancel the remaining harvest delivery schedule because the farm is preparing for sale. Act. I closed my eyes. If that contract collapsed, it would not just cost us money. It would leave fruit sitting in cold storage, throw off packing schedules, damage our standing with the co-op, act, and make every worker on the farm wonder whether their next check was real. Deanna, there has been no transfer of authority, no probate appointment, no trust administration meeting yet. I can send you the current contract, act, Hugh's last email confirmation, and the delivery schedule. I figured as much, she said. In 14 years, every problem from your farm has come through you. Not Tessa. That sentence steadied me more than she probably knew. Act. I'll send everything in 5 minutes. Do that. I'll keep the contract open pending legal confirmation. But Marin, you need to move fast. People like this do damage before the paperwork catches up. I know. And I did. Act. I was beginning to understand that Tessa's confidence was not harmless. It was a match dropped into dry grass. By late morning, the rumor had already reached town. Willa Novak stopped me outside the feed store. She was 60, act, owned the jam stand at the farmer's market, and had known my mother since before I was born. She looked uncomfortable in the way good people look when they are about to tell you something ugly. Honey, Grant posted something on Facebook. Act. I did not ask if it was bad. Her face had already answered. In my truck, I opened the post. Grant had written that sometimes the child who stayed behind was not selfless, just strategic. He said some people called it caregiving, act, but he called it positioning. Tessa had commented underneath, saying she only wanted to honor what mom and dad would have wanted, and she hoped everyone would pray for peace. Peace. That word sat in my throat like a pill I could not swallow. Act. Willa touched my arm. Some folks are talking. Some believe her because she's the older one. Some think Grant smells money. Most are just staying quiet. Quiet is easier, I said. She looked sad. Not always right, though. I did not reply to the post. Act. I screenshotted it. I saved the time. I saved the comments. I knew exactly what Grant wanted. He wanted me angry in public. He wanted me messy. He wanted me to become the unstable sister before the lawyers ever sat us down. So I stayed quiet, act, and I saved everything. Before lunch, I stopped at Valley Commonwealth Bank. The woman behind the desk knew me, but grief and banking policy made strangers of everyone. She could not tell me much, and I did not push. What she could confirm was simple. Act. No authorized signer had been changed on the farm operating account. Tessa could call herself owner all day long. She still could not touch payroll. From there, I went to the county recorder's office and found Miriam Sloan behind the counter, glasses low on her nose, silver hair clipped back. I can't give legal advice, she said before I finished explaining. I'm not asking for legal advice. I'm asking what the public record shows. She typed, clicked, waited, act, and turned the monitor slightly, just enough for me to understand without her crossing a line. As of today, public records do not show Tessa Whitlock Vale holding transfer authority over Whitlock Orchard Farm. If anyone tries to convey this property, title verification will raise questions. That was all she could say. It was enough. That afternoon, Pastor Malcolm Reed called and asked me to stop by First Creek Baptist Church. I almost ignored it, but my parents had sat in the third pew for 30 years, and I was still foolish enough to hope grief had limits. He met me in the small office behind the sanctuary, the same room where I had approved the funeral program 5 days earlier. Marin, act, he said gently. Your parents believed deeply in family peace. I sat across from him. They also believed in paying workers on time and not selling orchards behind closed doors. His mouth tightened. Tessa is the older daughter. Act. Sometimes families need one person to lead the transition. Did she mention a donation? He looked away. That was answer enough. The church roof is in bad shape, he said. Your parents were generous for many years. Act. Tessa said she intended to continue that support if the estate was handled peacefully. There it was again. Peace. My parents gave to this church because they believed in community, I said. Not so the church could use that word to make me step aside. Act. His face changed then, not into anger, but into shame he was not ready to admit. I left before he could bless the pressure he had just put on me. Back in the barn office, I called Ellis Rourke. This is not going to be a simple will reading. Act. He said after I told him everything. Because a substantial portion of your parents' property was transferred into trust years ago. Thursday's meeting is an estate and trust administration meeting. Until then, document everything and do not let them turn this into a shouting match. I gripped the edge of the desk. What do I bring? Everything: ledgers, payroll records, co-op contracts, insurance files, cold storage logs, screenshots, your lockout timeline. Act. Anything showing Tessa or Grant interfering with farm operations. Should I call the sheriff about the locks? If you are safe in the barn apartment, document it. Photograph the lock. Avoid physical confrontation. If they keep interfering, act, that becomes part of the record. By sunset, I thought the day had done all the damage it could. Then I saw the SUV. It was parked near the front gate, black and polished, too clean for a farm road. A man in a wool coat stood near the fence, act, taking photos of the driveway and the road frontage Dad had spent 2 weekends repairing after a storm washed out the ditch. I walked toward him with my phone already recording. Can I help you? He turned, startled. Nathan Klein. Ashland Ridge Homes. Act. I kept my voice even. And why are you photographing my family's property? He blinked. Grant Vale requested preliminary site access. He said the family ownership transition was nearly complete. Act. We're just evaluating road access for a potential residential development. The words residential development landed harder than sale. No one has authority to grant access to this land, I said. You need to leave. Nathan looked genuinely confused, Act then concerned. He lowered his phone. I was told your sister was handling the transfer. She is not. He backed away quickly after that, apologizing in the careful tone of a man realizing he might have walked into litigation. Act. I photographed his license plate, the SUV, the company logo on his folder, and the time he left. When the taillights disappeared down the road, I stayed at the gate. Dad had built that fence himself, one post at a time, Act. After saying no to developers for 20 years. Beyond it were the orchards, the barn, the cold storage building, the cattle pasture, the farmhouse with my mother's robe still inside, and for the first time, Act. I understood that Tessa and Grant were not just trying to sell the farm. They were trying to turn Whitlock Orchard Farm into a subdivision. Chapter 3 The next morning, Act. I walked down to the mailbox before breakfast because bills had always come before feelings on a farm. The mailbox still had Hugh and Lenora Whitlock painted on the side in faded black letters. Act. Tessa would not have known that the electric bill usually came on Tuesdays, the cold storage invoice on the first week of the month, and the co-op statements folded inside a larger white envelope with a blue return label. Act. She would not have known which envelopes mattered and which were junk, because she had never been the one standing there in the rain, sorting the farm's life by due date. That morning, tucked between a sympathy card and a notice from the feed supplier, was a thick envelope from Ashland Ridge Homes LLC. My fingers went cold before I even opened it. Inside was a non-binding letter of intent, printed on heavy paper offering 21 $6 million for all 238 acres of Whitlock Orchard Farm. The terms were careful, almost polite, pending title verification, pending environmental review, pending probate authority, pending clear conveyance. The land had not been sold. That part mattered. No money had changed hands. No deed had been transferred. But halfway down the second page, under anticipated seller, was my sister's name, Tessa Whitlock Vale. Below that was Grant's signature, marked authorized family representative. Grant had no authority over a fence post on that farm, but there it was in black ink, the kind of arrogance that looked harmless until a lawyer put it on a table. I kept reading. The development plan was worse than the number. 312 residential lots, a new access road cutting through the front orchard, a stormwater basin near the creek, a possible clubhouse where the cold storage building stood, the equipment shed marked for removal, the pasture broken into phases. I saw Dad's apple rows turned into street names. I saw the barn reduced to a before picture in a developer packet. I saw the creek where Mom used to sit with her coffee becoming a landscaping feature for strangers who would never know what had been buried under their sidewalks. I scanned every page and called Ellis Rourke. He was quiet while I explained. Does this mean they sold it? No, he said. A letter of intent is not a sale, it is not a deed. But if Tessa and Grant represented that they had authority they did not have, that is a problem. What kind of problem? The kind that becomes very difficult to explain when everyone is sitting in the same room. He told me to keep the original, send him the scan, and not confront them. That last part was hard. Every part of me wanted to march to the farmhouse and throw those pages onto Mom's kitchen table, but Mom had taught me that anger was loud and records lasted longer. Grant came to the barn office just before dark. He did not knock like a guest. He pushed the door open, stepped inside, and looked around at the binders on my desk with open contempt. You really set up camp in here. It has a lock that still works. His mouth tightened. He placed a document on my desk. Tessa wants this handled clean. I did not touch it. What is it? A waiver. You sign it, take $75,000, and walk away from any claim to the farm. I looked at him until he had to keep talking. That is real money, Marin. You could rent a place in town. Buy yourself something reliable. Start over instead of clinging to a life that was never really yours. There it was again. The idea that 14 years of work could be erased with a check small enough to fit inside Grant's idea of convenience. Who drafted it? A lawyer in Richmond. I finally picked it up, The paper looked official at first glance, but it had no estate case number, no trust reference, no executor authority, no personal representative named, no mention of probate, and no legal description of the property. It was not a legal solution, it was bait. This does not look like something an estate attorney drafted. Grant's expression shifted. You think you're smart because you can read bills and spreadsheets. I think people who have authority usually do not need to pressure someone in a barn after sunset. He stepped closer. You do not have a house anymore. You do not have money for a court fight. You do not have family support. Tessa is willing to be generous right now, but if you drag this out, she will make sure nobody in this county hires you again. I felt my heart beating in my throat, but my hand was steady near my phone. Then we will let the documents speak. Grant laughed, but it sounded forced. Documents do not love you, Marin. No, I said, but they do not lie for you either. He stared at me for a long second, then snatched the waiver halfway back before changing his mind and leaving it on the desk. Your mistake? He slammed the door hard enough to rattle the window. I sat there in the old silence of the barn office, not shaking from fear but from the fury of being priced like an inconvenience. On the desk in front of me were the waiver, the Ashland Ridge letter, the Facebook screenshots, Deanna's email, the lockout timeline, and my notes from Mateo and Caleb. Tessa and Grant thought they were pushing me out. What they were really doing was giving Ellis a folder. That night, I could not sleep. The cot against the wall smelled like dust and machine oil, and every time the wind moved through the rafters, I heard the farmhouse door closing in my head. Around midnight, I got up and started cleaning because stillness made me feel cornered. When I dragged the cot away from the wall, I found an old cardboard box tucked behind it. Mom's handwriting was on the lid, barn inventory. I almost smiled. Mom labeled everything, even boxes nobody opened, but inside there were no spare parts, no tags, no old seed packets. There was only a cream-colored envelope with my name on it. Marin, when you need the truth more than comfort. I sat on the floor before I opened it. The letter smelled faintly like the lavender hand lotion Mom kept by the kitchen sink. My dearest Marin, if you are reading this, then your father and I were probably right about what grief might bring out in your sister. I am sorry for that. I am sorry we could not protect you from the words, but we tried very hard to protect you from the consequences. Do not fight Tessa with volume. She has always known how to turn volume into a performance. Bring the ledgers, bring the payroll records, bring the co-op files, bring the insurance documents, bring the cold storage logs, bring the blue folder Ellis keeps. Then came the line that broke me. If she calls you hired help, remember this. The work she mocks is the work that proves who protected this place. I cried then, not loudly, not the kind of crying people see in movies, with shaking shoulders and dramatic hands over mouths. I cried sitting on the barn floor with my mother's letter in my lap, because she had seen me. All those years I thought I was just doing what needed to be done. She had been watching. She had known Tessa might come back for money. She had known I might be called small by the very people who had left me carrying everything, and she had left instructions so I would not have to defend my life with tears. The next morning, I met June Calloway at her kitchen table. She poured coffee, untouched by both of us, and read only the first page of Mom's letter, before covering my hand with hers. Your mother was afraid this would happen. You knew? I knew enough. Is there really something with Ellis? June nodded slowly. Your parents prepared documents years ago. Deanna and I signed as witnesses. I cannot tell you what is in them, because that is for Ellis to explain. But I can tell you this. Your mother loved both daughters. But she trusted only one of you with the farm. By afternoon, Tessa escalated again. She arrived at the barn with a locksmith and Grant standing behind her like hired muscle in loafers. This structure is part of my property, she said. I want the lock changed. The locksmith looked from her to me. Do you have proof of ownership or a court order? Tessa waved a printed property card from the county website. My family owns it. That is not the same thing, Mom. Caleb was near the equipment shed, close enough to hear everything. I took out my phone and began recording. Tessa's face flushed. She is trespassing. The locksmith handed the paper back. I am not touching that lock without proper authority. Grant muttered something under his breath. Tessa turned on me. You are a thief, Marin. I said nothing. I just saved the video. At sunset, Ellis called. His voice was lower than usual. Tomorrow morning is the meeting. Bring everything your mother listed. The ledgers, payroll, co-op files, insurance, cold storage logs, the LOI, the waiver, and the recording if you have it. June knows. June will be there. So will Deanna. I looked toward the farmhouse, where every window glowed like Tessa and Grant were celebrating early. Ellis paused. There are people in that room who need to remember they signed more than sympathy cards. After we hung up, I closed the final binder and slid Mom's letter into the inside pocket of my jacket. Across the yard, Tessa and Grant were in my parents' kitchen, probably talking about money, closings, and how quickly they could get me out. But tomorrow, they were going to hear about something bigger than a will. Chapter 4 Morning came without mercy. I dressed in a white button-down shirt, dark slacks, and the flat black shoes I used for bank meetings and co-op contract renewals. Nothing about me looked dramatic. That felt important. Tessa was expecting tears, maybe anger, maybe some last desperate speech about how much the farm meant to me. I gave her none of that. I put the ledgers in one bag, the payroll binder in another, and slid the USB drive, the Ashland Ridge letter, the waiver, the Facebook screenshots, the locksmith video, and Mom's letter into a folder I kept against my chest. Rourke and Bell Law Office sat on Main Street between a pharmacy and an insurance agency. I had been there before, with Dad for crop insurance questions, and with Momsum when she wanted a contract reviewed. But that morning the place felt different. The windows were clean, the carpet was quiet, and every chair in the conference room looked like it had been placed for a verdict. Ellis Rourke stood at the head of the table with 2 envelopes, a thick trust binder, and copies of everything I had sent him. June Calloway was already there, hands folded around her purse. Deanna Pike sat beside her, wearing her co-op jacket, her face calm but serious. Pastor Malcolm Reed came in a few minutes later and avoided looking at me. Then Tessa and Grant arrived. Tessa wore a cream suit and pearls like she expected photographs. Grant wore a navy blazer and carried a leather folder. They looked less like grieving family and more like people arriving at a real estate closing. Tessa stopped when she saw June and Deanna. What are they doing here? Ellis did not look up from his papers. They are here because they are named witnesses and because their testimony is relevant to trust administration. Grant pulled out a chair beside Tessa and set his folder on the table. I'm here as Tessa's representative. Ellis finally looked at him. Mr. Vale, you are not a beneficiary and you have no standing in this estate. You may remain only because Tessa requested your presence and agreed you could be present for the portions involving her interests. Your name also appears in documents my office received yesterday. So if you choose to stay, understand that your statements may become part of the record. Grant's expression barely changed, but his hand moved off the folder. Ellis began with the will. He said the personal property portion of my parents' estate left Tessa Whitlock Vale a conditional occupancy interest in the farmhouse, along with $310,000 from their personal savings account at Valley Commonwealth Bank. Tessa exhaled softly. She looked across the table at me with the smallest smile, as if the story had ended right there. Then Ellis continued. The farmhouse is not conveyed to Tessa in absolute ownership. It is a conditional occupancy interest. She may reside there if she maintains the property, does not sell it, does not lease it, does not mortgage it, does not materially alter it, and does not interfere with farm operations for a period of 5 years. Tessa's smile vanished. Ellis folded his hands. In plain terms, Tessa can live in the house if she protects it. She cannot use it as bait for a developer. She cannot lock out the person operating the farm. She cannot turn it into quick cash. Grant leaned forward. What about the land, the cold storage, the equipment, the mineral rights, the co-op shares? Ellis set the will down. That property is not controlled by the will. Tessa frowned. What does that mean? Ellis picked up the second envelope. It means your parents transferred Whitlock Orchard Farm into the Whitlock Family Irrevocable Trust on June 14, 2018. The room went still. Ellis opened the envelope and removed a clean, thick document with my parents' signatures copied on the first page. The trust includes 238 acres of farmland, the apple orchards, cattle infrastructure, cold storage facility, equipment, mineral rights registered with the Virginia Department of Energy, co-op shares at Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative, and the Whitlock Rural Scholarship Fund, currently valued at approximately $2.35 million. Fact. The most recent appraisal places total trust assets at $27.4 million. Tessa's face went pale. Grant whispered something to her. Ellis said, "Please do not interrupt." Then he read the trustee qualifications. Act. The trustee had to have at least 10 years of verified involvement in farm operations. The trustee had to maintain auditable financial records. The trustee had to have a documented working relationship with Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative. Act. The trustee had to reside or work regularly on the farm during the years immediately before Hugh and Lenora's deaths. The trustee had to be confirmed by at least 2 witnesses as capable of operating the farm. Act. Each sentence landed like a board being nailed over a door. Tessa thought she had already walked through everything she had mocked: the ledgers, the payroll, the co-op files, the cold storage logs. The years I stayed when she left Act had become the exact language that shut her out. Ellis turned one page. "The named trustee is Marin Elise Whitlock." Tessa stood halfway out of her chair. "No, absolutely not. You are not telling me she gets $27 million. Act. Ellis remained calm. "I am telling you she does not get to treat the trust like a personal checking account. She has fiduciary duties, but she has legal control as trustee. She has authority over farm operations. Act. She has a right of residence in the farmhouse or trustee residence. She is entitled to reasonable trustee compensation, farm operator salary, reimbursement for proper expenses, and legal defense from the trust if the trust is challenged without merit." Act. He looked directly at Tessa. "That means you cannot evict her. You cannot sell the farm. You cannot cancel contracts. You cannot interfere with workers. You cannot use the farmhouse to force her out." For the first time since my parents died, Act. I felt air reach the bottom of my lungs. June spoke next, her voice steady. "Hugh and Lenora signed those documents with clear minds. Lenora did not do this because she hated you, Tessa. Act. She did it because she knew this farm would be sold if it was not protected." Deanna opened the folder in front of her. "For 14 years, Marin has been the operating contact for Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative. If she had not maintained the records, Act, the delivery schedules, and the quality reports, that contract would not exist today." Tessa turned on me. "You manipulated them. You stayed close so they would give you everything." June's eyes sharpened. "Your mother knew you would say that. Act. That is why she asked for witnesses." Deanna added, "Marin never asked me for control. She asked me how to keep apples from spoiling and workers paid." Tessa looked toward Pastor Reed. "You told her family peace mattered." Ellis turned slightly. Act. "Pastor Reed, were you aware that Tessa had promised a donation to First Creek Baptist Church if she gained control of the farm?" Pastor Reed said nothing. I looked at him, not with anger loud enough to hide behind Act, but with the exhaustion of someone who finally understood. "Pastor, was peace the word you used because it sounded better than money?" His face collapsed a little, and that was answer enough. Grant suddenly cleared his throat. Act. The Ashland Ridge thing was just a conversation. Ellis placed the non-binding letter of intent on the table, followed by an email printout. "This letter identifies Tessa as anticipated owner and you as authorized family representative. Act. This email to Nathan Klein says Marin will be out by Friday." The letter does not sell the land, but misrepresenting authority in pursuit of a transaction is not just conversation. Grant looked at Tessa. She signed it. Tessa snapped back. "Act. You told me to sign before." Marin lawyered up. Their voices rose together, sharp and ugly, each one trying to hand the other the match after the fire had started. All their confidence turned into blame because every lie had become paper. Act. Ellis lifted one final letter. Hugh and Lenora also left a personal statement. He read it slowly. "My parents wrote that they loved both daughters. They left Tessa a chance to come home, not a blank check to sell what she had not built. Act. They wrote that the farm needed protection from panic, pride, and quick money." Then Ellis read the part addressed to me. "They wrote that the trust was not only responsibility, it was protection. It gave me a place to live, authority to operate, Act, compensation for the work, and legal defense so no one could lock me out of the life I had spent holding together." Tessa's voice shook with rage. "She was hired help." I looked at the binders on the table. "The hired help kept the books. Act. And the books don't lie." Ellis closed the binder. Tessa, you have the right to contest the trust. If you do, the legal defense clause applies. The lockout, the interference with farm operations, the attempted lock change at the barn, the public statements online, and the Ashland Ridge documents will all become part of the record. Tessa stood so fast her chair scraped the floor. Grant stood too, but he did not touch her. He looked smaller than he had when he walked in. For the first time since she came back to Whitlock Orchard Farm, Tessa did not say my house or my land. She only looked at Ellis and asked, almost under her breath, "So what happens to me now?" I did not answer for him. I looked at the second envelope lying open on the table and understood that the papers had finally said what I had never been brave enough to say out loud. I was not the hired help. I was the person my parents trusted to keep the farm alive. Chapter 5. For 3 days after that meeting, Tessa tried to live in the farmhouse, like staying there could prove she had not lost. She parked her rental car in Dad's spot. She drank coffee from Mom's cracked apple mug. She walked onto the porch each morning and stared across the orchard as if land might become hers if she looked at it long enough. But the farm did not bend for her. The septic alarm blinked on the second morning. The heating oil delivery invoice came due before lunch. A roofer left an estimate tucked in the storm door because one corner of the kitchen ceiling had started staining after the rain. By the fourth morning, I heard her yelling at Grant over the phone from the back porch. "This place is falling apart." She said it like the farmhouse had insulted her personally. The truth was simpler. She wanted the value of the farm without the weight of keeping it alive. She could not sell the house, she could not lease it, she could not mortgage it, she could not touch the operating account, she could not cancel the co-op contract, she could not order Mateo or Caleb off the property. She could not walk into the barn office and throw me out. What she had received was not a cash drawer. It was a 5-year test, and she had never wanted to pass it. I did not change the locks back that week. I wanted to. I wanted to stand on that porch with a new key in my hand and make her feel for 1 second what she had made me feel. But that was the difference between Tessa and me. She acted first and looked for permission later. I called Ellis. He sent a formal notice documenting the lockout, the attempted barn lock change, the interference with farm operations, and the conditions attached to her occupancy. The letter did not shout, it did not threaten. It simply listed facts in the clean, cold language that makes people like Tessa nervous. A few days later, Ellis introduced me to Dr. Claire Whitcomb, the CPA and tax advisor he wanted overseeing the trust setup. She was 49, precise, and impossible to impress. She sat across from me at the barn office desk and walked me through trustee compensation, farm operator salary, reimbursement procedures, insurance, tax compliance, and fiduciary duties. "This is not a blank check," she said. "I know. It is also not unpaid labor." That was the sentence that made me look up. For 14 years, I had treated my own work like something I had to apologize for. If payroll was done, if invoices were paid, if the cold storage stayed steady, if the co-op got what it needed, that had been enough. But now I signed documents that did not call me helpful. They called me trustee, operator, authorized decision maker. When I signed Marin E. Whitlock, trustee for the first time, my hand paused over the paper. The responsibility felt heavy, but underneath it was something I had not felt in years. Protection. I called Mateo first. "We're keeping the crew," I told him. He was quiet for a moment. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure enough to put it in writing." When he came by the next morning, he shook my hand with both of his. Caleb showed up 10 minutes later with his toolbox in the bed of his truck. "I didn't unload it," he said. "Had a feeling this place wasn't done with me." For the first time since the funeral, I laughed. We processed the missed hours properly. We documented what Tessa had done. We kept the cold storage running. Deanna Pike confirmed Blue Ridge Growers Cooperative would keep the harvest schedule open, and by Friday, apples left our property on time. The farm had been saved on paper in Ellis's office, but that week it started breathing again in real life. Grant's consequences came slower, but they came. Ashland Ridge Homes, through Nathan Klein, sent a letter asking why Grant and Tessa had represented themselves as authorized to discuss transfer of land they did not control. Grant had to hire his own attorney. The dealership where he worked began distancing itself from him after customers started asking why one of their sales managers was being mentioned in a failed development deal. No one fired him in a dramatic scene. Real life is rarely that clean, but his phone stopped ringing as often, and for a man like Grant, embarrassment was its own kind of foreclosure. Tessa cut him off first. He called her greedy. She called him a parasite. The two people who had stood together to push me out started tearing at each other the moment there was no money left to split. Pastor Malcolm Reed asked to meet me at First Creek Baptist Church before Thanksgiving. I almost said no. But Mom had believed people could admit when they were wrong, even if they waited too long to do it. He looked older than he had at the funeral. Marin, he said, I let fear guide me, not faith. I did not make it easy for him. You let a promised donation sound like peace. He closed his eyes. Yes, my parents gave to this church because they believed in community, not so the church could pressure their daughter into silence. He nodded. And for once he did not try to soften the truth with scripture. A week later, he made a public apology that was careful but real, and he stepped down from the church finance board. Reverend Eileen Brooks came in from a nearby church network to help with community outreach while things settled. I did not need the whole town to choose my side. I only needed the people who had used peace as a weapon to stop pretending it had been kindness. Tessa lasted less than 2 weeks in the farmhouse. She complained about the septic system, the heating oil, the roof estimate, the cattle smell, the truck starting before sunrise, and the fact that no one in town treated her like the lady of the manor. Then she left for Richmond. She did not destroy the house. She was too careful for that. But she left drawers open, moved Mom's things into strange places, and left the pantry scattered like she had searched for something she never found. Ellis did not announce that the house was mine the next day. He began the formal process to document her breach of the occupancy conditions. Tessa received the notice and finally understood what a fight would cost her. The trust would pay for its legal defense, and the record would include the lockout, the barn incident, the Ashland Ridge letter, June Deanna, and every file she had mocked. A few weeks later, rather than pay a lawyer to defend a house she never wanted to live in, Tessa signed a surrender of her conditional occupancy interest. The farmhouse returned to the Whitlock family irrevocable trust. I moved back in on a cold December afternoon. I did change the locks then, but not the way Tessa had. Ellis had the new access documented. A spare key went into a lockbox for trust purposes. Every step was recorded. Every signature was clean. When the locksmith handed me the new key, I stood on the porch for a long moment before going inside. The house smelled faintly of dust, coffee, and the lemon oil Mom used on the kitchen table. I cleaned her office myself. I put her letter in a small frame beside the first farm ledger she had ever taught me to balance. For the first time since the funeral, that room felt less like evidence of what had been taken and more like proof of what had been protected. That same month, the Whitlock Rural Scholarship Fund issued its first 4 awards, $12,000 each, for local students studying agriculture, land management, veterinary technology, and rural community development. I signed the checks at Mom's kitchen table, where she had once taught me to sort invoices with colored tabs. Tessa called once before Christmas. So you're just sitting on $27 million now? I looked out the kitchen window at the orchard. No, I'm managing a trust, a farm, workers' land, a scholarship fund. And the responsibilities Mom and Dad protected. You got everything. You had a chance to come home for 5 years, I said. You just did not want the life that came with it. The silence after that was longer than any argument we had ever had. Before she hung up, I told her if she ever wanted to visit Mom and Dad's graves or talk without lawyers, she could call first. I meant it. I did not want to become cruel just because cruelty had finally failed. But I also told her the farm was no longer something she could bargain with. On the last cold morning of December, I stood on the porch with the new key in my hand. The orchard was bare. The cattle breathed white into the air. The cold storage building hummed in the distance. Somewhere beyond the barn, Caleb started an engine that Dad would have recognized by sound alone. I thought about what Tessa had called me, hired help. For years, I might have let that word shrink me. But now I knew better. The work she mocked was 14 years of keeping the farm alive, paying people on time, protecting contracts, caring for my parents, and staying when leaving would have been easier. This time, I was not standing outside the door. I was inside the house, looking out at the land my parents had protected, holding the key to a life they had trusted me to continue. They had not just left me a farm, they had left proof that I had never been invisible. And if you were in my place, what would you think? Should the daughter who stayed, worked the land, paid the bills, and cared for her parents control the trust? Or should the sister who left still get an equal share just because she is family?